We have 4 signs Uncorked. So we have this one, which is all about building resilience, working with nature. We also have next month on February 19th, we will have desalination innovations. I had a great conversation with Dr. Peter Fisk, who's with the National Alliance for Watershed Innovation, and he's going to be talking about some of that with his projects. The next month in March is going to be Los Padres Dam, and then we're going to end up with a project we're launching that's going to be really quite exciting, a watershed opportunities map. So those are going to be our 4. One of the best things about this series, aside from the fact that it's always nice to drink wine and find out about water, is the great questions we get from our audience and the conversations with our board. So who do we have from our board today? Scott, would you stand up? Yeah. And we also have Abby here. So we have a couple people from our board. And let's see, I want to thank, of course, Russell Joyce, who gives us this space and also has created that private label Riverwise wine for us in order to have us a little bit of your wine the water that goes into the wine gets a little benefit back to the river, because 30% of those bottles sold come back to our efforts. So let's see, is there anything else before we start that I forgot to?
If somebody wants to nibble on something, help me, please.
You can nibble on He has good lobes. So our first speaker, we have 2 presentations. So John is with CSUMB, official title.
Associate Professor.
Associate Professor John Olson, and CSUMB is a great partnership with us. They have their graduate students need to do practical work, and so we have fire work, which John's going to be reporting on, talking about fire in the watershed and the impacts of fire in the watershed. They also do update our watershed report card and other projects as well. We did a vegetation mapping project for the RCD this summer, and so we had another student from CSUMB. So you guys are great partners, and thank you very much. And take it away. John, do you know how to push this forward? Okay.
Thanks, Lise. So as I go, if there's questions, please stop me or talking. And because I'm going to cover all the ground, and I don't want to necessarily have to backtrack. So please go ahead and stop me as we go. So talking about disasters, there's 2 ways to think about how you deal with the disturbances. You can either build up resistance, so you don't iron chain, basically. It hopefully doesn't bend and hopefully it doesn't break. If it does break, then it just come back. Or resilience, which is kind of more like a rubber band, where you can stretch it, but it basically will return back to shape. So we're going to be talking a little bit of both of these things here tonight. When we think about the big disasters that are tied to the river, there's 2 of them. There's floods, which we're not really going to cover tonight. The floods are still part of it, as well as fires, small fires. That's where we're going to focus mostly tonight's talks. And fires are an important thing to consider, given the fact that we're living in a fire-prone environment. This is the map of the watershed, and essentially everything that's orange or red is basically going to be a place that's going to burn at least every 15 years by design. And so the vegetation area has a fire return interval of 15 years or less. So you're going to see these places burn over and over again. So when we design, how we live these places, you basically have to design the fact that when we have fire, it's going to be fairly constant. It's going to be, it's not something that happens once in your life. It's something that happens multiple times in your life. The blue and the green areas are ones that have longer fire return intervals. They burn maybe once in your lifetime, maybe 70 or 80 or 120 years. So the first project I'm talking about was one done by an undergraduate, Destiny Sierra Llano. She graduated this last spring. And she did this project where we're looking at how riparian forests affect wildfires. So her question she was looking at is the fact that, we often, homeowners often advise cut back all the vegetation within your area. So you have these homeowners that own something overlooking the river, they want to basically go in and cut down all the riparian forest around their house. So they're told, cut back all the vegetation next to your house. The problem is, riparian forests are not the same as an upland forest. Riparian forests are actually resistant to fire. And you actually may be putting your house more at risk by cutting down all the riparian forests. Or it might be better actually leave it alone. We wanted to actually test this idea and see if this is actually true. So her objective was basically to look at whether riparian forests show resistance to the wildfires in Central California. And her hypothesis was basically that riparian forests will have less severe burns than you might see in other areas. This is a good example from the Rocky Mountains where you can see this riparian floodplain. Everything burnt around it. The entire forest went down around it, but the floodplain itself stayed intact. And it's not facing that harm. Why? Because the floodplains are full of water. Plants all have the roots that are in the water table and bring the water up to the surface. So they're too wet to burn, even in large wildfires. So the way she went about investigating this is she basically started off with the Sobrani's watershed. Sobrani's watershed is a small creek down in Big Sur. And she went through and basically, by hand, drew a little polygon, a little shape around each one of the riparian forests. So she went and looked for the change in vegetation and basically circled all the places where we had these riparian forests existing. Next, she went through and basically determined what the burn severity was in these places. So the U.S. Forest Service, along with other agencies, developed what they call the burn area emergency response soil burn severity maps. And basically these, they basically go through and look at 30 meter pixel size, go through and attribute whether it's unburned, low burn, medium burn, or high burn severity. So we pulled this data from the Sobrani's fire. And we went through basically for each one of our riparian forests, we measured what the burn severity was in that riparian forest. Then we measured burn severity for all the places outside the riparian forest, all the places upland. This is what the map looked like. The kind of aquamarine green polygons are the riparian forests. And the pixels behind it show the burn severity, with red being the high severity burns, brown being medium severities, and yellow being low severity burns. And she went through and basically summarized all this data, and just to show you the percent of portion of the area burned by burn severity. And when the first thing we noticed was the fact that moderate severity burns actually were greater in the riparian areas than were in the which is kind of opposite of what we expected. We expected to see less moderate severity burns in these areas. So it's a little bit of surprise when we first saw that. And when we look at the low severity burns, we basically see the riparian areas actually had less low severity burns. We actually want to see that flipped. So it's opposite of what we're expecting to see. And the high severity burns, which are relatively uncommon, but we would focus on just the high severity burns. You basically see that all those high severity burns we saw actually were in the uplands. The riparian area forests had no high severity burns. So it did lose protection from high severity burns in this case. But Sobrani's Creek is a relatively small creek for those of you who have gone hiking up there now. It's about as wide as the table here. Which creek? Sobrani's. So it's about as wide as the creek here, and the floodplain for a creek this wide is essentially the door to the projector. So it's a relatively narrow floodplain. This is a small creek. So we want to look at the Big Sur River and see if the Big Sur River would give us a different response. So the Big Sur River is probably better analogous to the Carmel than Sobrani's Creek is. So we did the same thing. We went through and basically drew polygons around all the riparian forests, took the burn severity data and calculated what the burn severity was for each of those polygons, both for the uplands as well as the riparian forest. And here what we saw was that the moderate severity burns actually were less in the apparent forest. So when you actually have a larger floodplain, you can see an actual decrease in the amount of moderate severity burns. And you see actually more low severity burns occurring. So even though this area burned, there was low severity burns in the riparian area. So our takeaways are basically small streams. You don't necessarily see much of an effect except for the high severity burns. But for larger rivers, you do see this decrease in the amount of burns you see with the larger floodplains you have in large rivers. But the condition of floodplain is important to consider. Floodplains are not all equal. So this is an example showing you on the left a healthy floodplain, where the water floods onto the floodplain and the water table is high, and the vegetation is able to be wet vegetation that helps us prevent fires. Compared to that to the floodplain on the right, this is a floodplain that's been degraded. What's happened here is, for whatever reason, this channel is actually cut down into its banks, and it's now basically no longer connected to the floodplain. The floodplain is usually much higher. So this connection, what happens is when the water table drops as the river degrades its bed, the vegetation is left to dry out. So this no longer has wet vegetation in the floodplain, but the floodplain now has lots of vegetation that's dry, which is not what we want. So you actually have to consider how well connected your river is to your floodplain. So I'm going to show you a project done by Erica Garrett, where she went and looked at the amount of connectivity from the Carmel River between the floodplains and river to see how much of a problem there is and where the problems are. To do this, first we went through and pulled a bunch of data where we basically figured out what bank full height is. So bank full height is basically the level the river gets to usually every other year. So every other year during the wet season, we have a bank full of flood. We figure this is the average flood we get. So this is the most common flood we have on a yearly basis. And we can derive that by looking at where vegetation is living and looking at geomorphological signals to see where we're seeing the bank full height to be. And then we actually measure where the floodplain height is. So where is this floodplain? We're at the point where you're no longer in the river channel, you're actually out on the floodplain itself. So we actually measured that height. We compared floodplain height to 2 times the bank full height. So basically we're saying this is going to be larger floods. These are the floods that are going to get up in the floodplain most commonly. And if your 2 times the bank full height is twice is greater than your floodplain height, we're going to consider that connected. Places where the twice the annual flood is, that's above the floodplain, it's connected. Lower than that, and so here's an example where we're disconnected. The floodplain height is higher than twice the yearly flood. So this would be not connected. And so we can basically apply that to the entire Carmel River. So the places in white here are the ones that are connected. The places in red are disconnected. So we see these large disconnections, like down here around Pochero Creek, where Pelican Park is at. Pelican Park is right out undergoing restoration to actually reconnect this one place. If you've gone to Pelican Park, actually back up for a second. This is a picture of off the bridge of Pelican Park where you can't really see it because all the vegetation. Essentially, these banks here are about 20 feet above the river. Right? The floodplain that was there about 20 feet above the river. And essentially, this river is cut down into this channel, such that it's now about 20 feet above. And the sides here, although they're covered with vegetation, are essentially cliffs. So this was definitely a disconnected river. So we saw a disconnected river up, around Pochero Creek, as well as just above Garza Creek, and a couple of places down in here, which are shallow. We see the disconnected rivers. So these are places where if we want to basically rely on the floodplains to provide fire protection, we have to go out and do some restoration to actually try to reconnect some of the floodplains with their actual river. What we're doing in Colorado Park is we're basically lowering the entire floodplain, bringing the floodplain down to where the river's at, so the floodplain can now be reconnected. The other option, though, is to basically raise the river up, basically fill the channel back in, bring the river back into the floodplain.
Which is more difficult because it will erode.
It can be more difficult, yes. It kind of depends on the situation.
Okay.
Never give a definitive statement to a scientist. So maybe.
So one other way of actually restoring rivers that is actually bringing beavers. Beaver analogs are basically man-made structures that mimic the way beaver dams operate. A better way of doing it is actually use beavers. Beavers build better dams than humans do, and they work for free. So this is a project done by a graduate student of mine, Mike Pasolati. Mike basically was looking at the, he actually wanted to look for a project where he had basically updated the software system that helps predict where beavers should be at, and they applied it to the Carmel River. So he produced a couple of maps. Basically, he made these predictions using this sort of data. So he used a stream network as well as existing historic vegetation, as well as stream flows and slope. And just to cut to the chase, this is a map showing you where the beavers were. It would be, so blue is showing you high beaver densities. These are beaver densities of about 15 to 40 dams per kilometer. So lots of beavers over the blue. That's with the historical vegetation. So this is what the beavers would have been at when colonization happened. The beavers would have been all over the place. Where they would be at today, so if beavers got here today, those blue lines still exist. They're mostly along the main stem of the Carmel and Shower Creek. So the blue lines basically show you there's still great plenty places where beavers would be happily at home and highly prevalent.
Can you tell us where that, the Sub Day, if that's his last name, where that was published, or?
Oh, that's a lot. He hasn't published it. So actually, he did this for a class project.
Oh, really? Oh.
And with that, I'll stop and take any questions.
So the burn severity, did you cross-reference the burn severity mapping with the floodplain, whether the floodplain was healthy there or not?
No. So we did not look at the fact that we had. But I'm going to argue that Sparnex is relatively unimpacted and it's probably relatively natural in terms of it's relatively connected. Part of the Sparnex I've seen most of it. So I would say in both of the instances, we saw a big certificate that is at lower culture will impact. They're relatively intact, relatively well connected. So I would say we saw Swash Creek in terms of the fact that it doesn't necessarily provide much protections. It's really more a function of the fact that the flood was only 10 feet across.
Right.
Not 100 meters, 500 meters.
Right.
Yeah.
Did he run the beaver analysis down like in Sur area or because they?
No, he made just kind of all
Just Carmel.
Yeah, just trying to come over with that's He actually did that mostly for a demonstration of the software ability. So we have the software, so if somebody like another student run the software through and look at a picture. I mean, there are beavers now in the Runner Circle. They're right next door to us. And so beavers showing up in Carmel is something that's not a question of if, it's a question of when.
Did he contact at any time the people in San Luis Obispo that are actually trying to produce beaver dams?
No, he went ahead and did this on his own. And so he talked about.
I meant in the future. I mean, I don't know what the connection would be, but
Right.
you know, they might like to know about that.
Well, certainly people that are really interested in after, there are people talking about restoring beavers in the Carmel River.
Yeah.
And being able to know what places in the Carmel are going to be places, good places to actually bring beavers and try to establish.
Thanks, John, by the way, for the presentation. I was curious with the floodplain connectivity, like at Garza's Creek and then in Shallow, you mentioned the two other areas. I don't know if there's been any discussion on how to improve that, or like if the, whatever happens with the Los Padres Dam decisions, that would affect those areas.
Well, yes, the fact that you have this down cutting happening below the dam is fairly common. And dam basically release water out of the sediment and the send from the roads into that bank that causes that disconnection. So maybe part of the competition when we decide to take the dam down, it may not be this time around, maybe 50 years from now, but it's time point in time that dam comes down. We probably should also talk about trying to restore the floodplain more, given the fact that the fire is a problem in that part. All right. Yeah.
I have a question about the beavers. I think it was 2 years ago, I could be wrong, is correct. There was an excellent speaker on beavers, and he actually enchanted the entire audience at the wildfire day. 2 years ago.
They were great, yeah. We'll be at the next wildfire day again.
Okay, and excellent. And I know that there's a lot of interest in bringing them back, but a lot of things have changed since the time. The climate's really changed in the last, since the historical.
Right.
What could be done to actually bring them back? I'm knowing that it probably would benefit the river. And how safe would they be? I mean, has so much changed that it would be an experiment in fatality, bringing them in, and then having them just succumb to.
I think the fact that they're successful in other places in California, such as they're successful in Royal State, which is next door. So I would say, that given the fact that map trees showed there's not as much blue on it as we had before with sort of vegetation. Current vegetation still supports in lots of places beavers. So I think we can give beavers, especially in the main stem to Carmel, maybe not quite as many in the tributaries, but we certainly the main stem to have some beavers.
For reintroduction, I mean, you're looking at one of the sizable, relatively speaking, waterways in our area. What if we brought it into, say, Big Sur, and one of the creeks, Ronnie Creek, which runs all the way down the mountain to the coast? Could they be introduced there? Would it make a difference to? Obviously, I'm a novice, but it's a fascinating thing, and I think it would be wonderful.
Well, I don't know,
How do we do that?
they could be reintroduced, but the fact is they're probably going to reintroduce themselves if not.
Can I jump in on this? So we have a couple different property owners in our valley that would like to have beavers and have asked for beavers to come. And the Fish and Wildlife has a whole division which is dedicated to people that will come and analyze your site. And they are giving preference. There's like only 2 people or something in the department, and so it's very difficult for them to get through all the sites in California that want them. And so there's a real big backlog at this point. And so they are prioritizing the really large landowners, like Hastings would have a much better chance of getting it than a local farmer. And so, yeah, that's happening. But we also, within the regional priority plan, there have been a couple requests for analog beaver dams. So again, Hastings is going to be putting in some analog dams in order to try to make that happen. So, and as you say, they are slowly but surely coming back. So there are quite a few in Salinas. We have kind of a plan to go driving over there, open up our back door of our car and see if we can attract jump in. But that hasn't worked yet. But yeah, I think you're right. Probably they'll start coming here given time. Yeah.
Very interesting.
So I wanted to just take a look at these concepts and take them down to, so how does this apply to homeowners, which is kind of what you're getting at. Like, a lot of homeowners don't want to have anything to do with beavers because they're like, we don't want our lands to be flooded. And obviously, not many homeowners are going to be able to do something like the Rancho Cañada floodplain project, you know, because even though we want rivers to start having lots of room to flood and to move around, that's not all that possible within some of our landscapes the way it is. So as this points out, healthy, you know, one of the biggest challenges of climate resilience is the management of water. The biggest impacts come with huge storms, with floods, with drought. And so a watershed has a real important place to play in terms of being able to manage our climate resilience. I don't know why. So I think this is showcases what John was showing, which is that you can have a scourged channeled river, or you can have a floodplain river where it spreads out and can really slow and sink and hold the water. And within that, what we're trying to do, you can see with a riparian degradation, the more a channel gets scoured, the less water you have within the overall system, which inherently means the less resilience you have to fire and flood. This is an interesting diagram because here it shows what's going on in Rancho Cañada now before the work being done, because you have a very channelized river and you have completely dry and unhealthy areas on either side. But the more you bring back, in this case it's beaver, but also just natural refuse, and put it in and start spreading it out, the healthier your river gets, but also the healthier and the more, you can just see how much more water is within that system. And it's just sort of logical in the amount of, and I just keep this in because it's sort of just a funny thing that in the 40s, California discovered that we did not have enough beavers in the forest systems, and so they started parachuting them into the areas. But so what we want to do is to encourage people. They tried putting them on backs of horses, but they died, and so we found that parachuting them in was the best thing. So what we want to teach homeowners to do is to learn how to act like beaver, which is to, within your own property, learn to slow it, sink it, and store it, because that will make that happen. So I didn't realize that you were going to cover that. So the Rancho Cañada project and the Carmel River Free projects are the two large projects which are for floodplain restoration, but also for flooding results. But one of the things that's really important to remember is that we're all connected. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier today is the fact that, you know, at some point everybody says we want to keep water coming through the main stem of the river. And that's great for the bullfrogs because that helps them live through the summer. Unfortunately, the bullfrogs eat our native red-legged frogs. And so by not having the natural drying up, you have this unintended consequence. So one of the things that happens in a watershed is that neighbors in an upland may not understand how they're affecting the people around them. So for example, if you have up here where water should be percolating into the landscape, if you have up here a whole bunch of concrete where you have your winery people having a wonderful time, instead of having permeable surfaces in there, that water is now going to run all the way through and flood what's below it. And so it's really important for us to understand the interconnectedness of how water works within the whole system. So small acts that you can do within your home have a big impact in terms of increasing groundwater permeability and storage. So these are some of the solutions. On your table, there are materials that have these in them so that you can take them home and go, you know, I could put a bioswale in here. I could do this. So one of the things that's important that John was talking about is that it's important to connect the floodplains all the way through, not to just rely upon one big one in the middle and one big one at the bottom and go, oh, we got it covered. We really need to connect them all the way through, and that means having the people that are living and within the watershed working together. So some of the things that people do here and that I've run into many times is, clear cutting riparian zones. I'm going to go down to this area against the river and I'm going to clear cut it, and that will reduce my fire risk, and that will take care of giving me a place to put a deck, and life will be good. Unfortunately, that leads to the long-term degradation of the river and to the floodplains, and it will cause drought, drying up of the land, and it will also cause, it will take away that protective aspect of the riparian corridor. Another one I just mentioned is building with non-permeable surfaces. And one of the other things that has happened with one of our neighbors is the agricultural producer above him has planted everything in rows with nothing in between them. And every single winter, the water just goes whoosh. It just runs right through because there's no permeability in that land whatsoever. And then that comes in and it creates gullies in his property and breaks it up and causes problems in his property. So, ensuring that you're thinking about your neighbors as you go is really important. So one of the things that's been happening throughout the world, actually China is really famous for these, is building a sponge community. Are you guys familiar with that concept? So it's basically working to make your city or community be designed with permeable surfaces that will act as a natural sponge to have all these great effects. So one of the areas, cities in China that did this, I think it was Shanghai, found there was a low-lying area where they had massive flooding every single year, and they broke up all that concrete in that area and put in stormwater ponds and put in permeable surfaces that is a lovely park when it's not flooding, and it becomes a huge sink for water when there is flooding. And so they basically eliminated their flooding problems. So when we look at places like Paso Hondo, could there be some rainwater ponds and things put between properties that they can work on together in order to increase the permeability? And this is a good picture of what a sponge watershed looks like, is that through native plants, through putting in places to capture, slow sink, and store the water, it just inherently increases the permeability of the soil and the ability of it to hold water so that you reduce drought, flooding, and fire. So here are some of the things you can do: permeable surfaces, green infrastructure, thinking through green roofs and plant lancing, and doing as much water retention as you can. This is one that I just learned about, which is, it's hard to see, but this is a test that the Occidental Arts and Ecology system have created, and this is called gully stuffing. So if you have gullies that have been created by these scouring water runoffs that are nothing but creating a scar in the area, what they do is they cut down the area. So here they are doing fire limbing, and then instead of taking that material and burning it, they stuff the gully with it. So they're stuffing gullies with this biomass, and then as the winter rains come in, it makes this whole thing wet, and then it starts to spread the water and retain the water better in situ. What is fascinating about this, and I don't have the picture of it because it's in a video from OAAC. So if you look up gully stuffing and play a video, they'll show you what happened when they then went through and did a controlled burn in the area, and everything burns except for the gullies. All that material in the gully that stays wet and it doesn't burn. And so you can put more biomass in. You can think of it almost as a horizontal beaver dam. It's a similar thought process. Oh, so back to the beaver thing. Occidental Arts and Ecology, they're huge beaver fans. And so I said to Brock, who's the guy who's in charge of this there, I said, Brock, how do we get beavers in the Carmel River? And he's like, well, you go through the Fish and Wildlife, and they're over-tasked, and they don't, they have too much, and there's no way you're gonna get it done. He's like, but there is a black hat organization that will bring in beavers at night. I was like, Brock, can you get me in touch with them? He's like, anyway, so if we want a black hat beaver, I can hook you up. So this is a much more obvious thing that you've heard much more about, which is getting permaculture design done in your home. So even just making these small changes in your property makes a big impact in terms of the watershed. So that's why we've created these stewardship toolkits. But what we found is that I had so many property owners come up to me and say, okay, I want to do these things now, so come up to my property and tell me how to do them. And, that's hard. So I contacted Denise Duffy Associates. Is Josh still here? Denise.
Oh, Denise Duffy.
I reached out to Denise and said, Denise, will you help me with this? And that did not work out. But Josh is here now, and we'll make it happen. So what our next task is that we hired an organization called the Watershed Progressive, and they're mapping our entire watershed, and they are doing a data analysis where they'll be able to give us specific information, like, right here you have this much irrigated land that we can see, and you have this much rainfall, and if you put in this kind of rainwater catchment and these kind of bioswales, you will keep this much water from being pulled out of the river, and you will have this kind of an impact. And this is really important for a couple reasons. One is because now we'll be able to go to the landowners in this area and say, here are things you can do to specifically improve your land, and we can help you with it. And then the second piece about it is that we then have data out of that map where we can say, we can go to a grant maker and say, if we have a grant at your school to put rainwater catchment tanks and a rainwater garden, and we have a native planting project, and we bring your kids in to get involved in this, they will not only learn about how to do these things, but we will be able to keep a bunch more water in the river, because we're no longer going to be pulling well water out and river water out to water the soccer fields. So, we can have some, transformational effect on the water use in the area. We can work with landowners to make those things happen, and we can find funding. I've already got 3 grants lined up, funding in order to be able to help people pay for these changes. And so this is the beginning really of our Riverwise program, that concept that what we want to do is to teach everyone to be Riverwise, and through that, slow it, sink it, store it, so that our whole watershed is managed better in terms of the hydrologic water resources within it. So that's what we're working on, and this is how we build resilience against fire, flood, and drought. So those are our stewardship things, and do you have any questions about all that? No? Yeah?
Are you calling it forbearance for?
No. So once upon a time, we had a forbearance committee, and the forbearance committee created agreements with landowners where we would pay for, the organization, whoever it was, would pay for catchment tanks to be put on their property. And that those water catchment tanks would store water, and then they had to sign a legal agreement that said, if you put this tank on our property, then we will not take any water out during the summer. And that became a lien on people's property. And so while it sounds like a really great quid pro quo, we're gonna give you something to store water and then you don't have to pull it from the river. A lot of people did not like that because first of all, you had a legal lien on the property. Nobody likes that. And the second thing was that you had a situation where they had to say, we will not take water from the river in the summer. And a lot of agriculture and other users are like, well, we can promise that during good water years, we won't do it, but we're not willing to promise it all the time. So the forbearance committee, worked really hard on developing a program that didn't succeed. The other problem about that is that you have to have an organization that legally can hold those legal agreements. And so when I came in, I was like, if that didn't work, what we really probably want to do is to create something that is a positive effect. It's we're here to help you. We're here to give you resources, not to make you make promises you can't keep. And we're not going to put you under any legal bind. What we're going to do is we're going to come and we're going to help you. We have paid for this map so that we can tell you about your property specifically. We're going to be designing projects that will happen in large public spaces like the Shower Community Park and then schools. And we'll hopefully be working with some local providers to do those projects. And then we're also going to be helping find resources so that people can get coconut coir or tanks or whatever with rebates and good prices. So that's how we're working to first educate people on what needs to be done, and secondly, help provide resources to get it done rather than coming down with a big legal cudgel. That's the way we're going about that. Thank you for that good question, too.
Thank you.
Because, as you know, it's not, sometimes you learn from unsuccessful projects, what didn't work and try to figure out how to get there. We also have found one of the number one times when people get big fines on their property tend to be when you get someone new moving in. This is where you come in. He's a realtor. Which is that the new people don't really know how things operate in this area. And so we have these great, things, drought, vegetation, and then there are the rules and things so that hopefully we want realtors to give these out to their new customers so that people say, oh, I really need to pay attention to this before I start building a deck that brings it into the right area corridor. Because the other piece that maybe your analysis might not have come up to is if there are structures that are going into that creek area. Because sometimes if someone can build a deck, for example, that goes out over into the right area corridor, that can bring fire right in, whereas you might have had a green fuel break, and instead what you've got is like this lovely corridor for the fire to follow, and then takes the fire up the river. So it's amazing how much individual stewardship matters. One stupid deck and screws up, and those things can cause big fines, but also we want to stop them because it's dangerous for all of us. So that's what we're trying to do. Anything else? Yeah.
What about direct-to-consumer marketing? I mean, there's it's public record when there's a real estate sale and purchase. The name of the person and the address. Why not just mail them a packet?
That's a good point. We can do that.
It doesn't cost that much. There's some postage and copying and administration. But
administration, yeah, it would probably cost about $10 per person, which it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're a nonprofit just trying to get by, that's a lot. So if somebody would want to, what I was hoping is that we could, get some partners that would pass them out, which would take away some of that labor and time. But I don't know, maybe Tristan will advise me on how to do that, or someone will want to pay for the postage for that. But you're right. You're absolutely right. That is a good way to go. It just feels a little overwhelming to me. Aaron and I are the foot soldiers on this. So that's what we're doing. Anything else?
I love how you brought up permaculture right at the very end. I studied in Ecuador for a little bit doing permaculture, and just trapping water as high up on the landscape can actually create a spring down at the bottom. Are you working with are there any companies or any small businesses in the area that are focusing on bringing permaculture to the relatively large properties here in the Carmel Valley that can be reached out to kind of bring it more localized?
You know, Josh might know that better than I would.
I don't have an answer to that question.
You know what I'm answering that? I know that the master gardeners do that, but I don't know how many people avail themselves of that. I also know that the water management district, if you look on the water management district site, the Monterey Peninsula Water Management District, they are kind of constantly running programs for this sort of thing, for vegetation, permaculture, and those sorts of things. But I don't know of any real hardcore effort, so I wanna make sure we include that. I think it's really important because it will help make the ground, it helps make the ground spongy, which is where we're trying to get. So, could we usually have I think the last, some of the topics like the Los Padres Dam and desalination, we had like 100 and some people in the room, but we have such a intimate group here. I know we have Jim here from the, he's looking around, from the Steelhead Association, and so
Talk to me about volunteering.
they're always out there. So they do fish rescues. And you want to share a little bit about what your fish rescues look like in the summer?
They're a lot of fun.
They are.
They're intimate. You get a chance to run up and down various creeks that you probably wouldn't have had a chance to run up and down. We rescued, I'm so proud, 13,000 last year. And we've had several, we pit tag them, and several of them have come back, one 28-incher, and we're doing just bang up work. I'm just a bucket carrier. There's other people that are doing more intelligent work, but it's a lot of fun. You can talk to me about it, and I can special assistance for me.
Now, the fascinating thing it wasn't last year, because last year I had a new hip and I couldn't do it. But the year before, when I was up there pit tracking, it was fascinating because there we were up in the tributaries, and there was all kinds of water, and there were all kinds of baby steelhead there. And then we were catching them and putting them in buckets. And I'm thinking, why are we catching these fish that are happy here in this lovely tributary? But then the next week was a warm week, and all the wells in the area turned on. And we went back; they were all gone. Water was gone. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable how
We
fast.
release them where they will have a year-round being water flow and to get them to the ocean.
What do you do about the steelhead that are really deep in them? Oh, the stripers that are really deep.
I heard steelhead, I heard stripers.
Well, mid-steelhead, striper.
The stripers are back in that theme that we brought up early on, which is unintended consequence.
Yeah.
So the stripers were brought out from the East Coast by Fish and Wildlife because they thought, in the 30s, because they thought, let's create a new sport fishing experience on the West Coast. And so they dropped them in the Delta, thinking, oh, they'll stay right here in the Delta where we put them. And now they're coming up in the Carmel Valley and they're eating the steelhead. We also have brown trout, which are also invasive in the river, eating the steelhead. And it's kind of a fascinating thing because we'd love to make it so that people could fish for the stripers and the trout and leave the steelhead alone. The problem about that is that, for good reason, California Fish and Wildlife are like, well, we don't have enough rangers to be going and checking what's in people's buckets, so there are either fishermen out or there aren't. So they have, no fishing allowed through, I think you have fishing allowed like November to February, something like that. Most of the
No, I'm not a fisherman, I just rescue.
most of the year, you don't eat them, you just save them.
No.
So most of the year is not, there's no fishing allowed. And the Steelhead Association and Trout Unlimited have a grant from the state to study the innards of the stripers. So for the last 2 springs, they were down catching the stripers and cutting open their bellies and putting things into, sending that off to DNA labs, because what they wanted to do through this scientific experiment was to show how many fish steelhead they were eating, with the concept being that if they were eating fewer fish than we thought fishermen might take out, we could relax some of the fishing rules and get people out to catch the stripers. However, I don't think they've so far proven that point, although we have found some fascinating things in there. I mean, I remember opening one up and there was a mouse in the middle.
Yeah.
There was a mouse.
Mouse or a rat.
It was astounding. And then there was another thing that was like a completely unidentifiable thing that I think should have belonged in an alien movie. I was like, there are things in that river you don't want to know about. So anyway, there are studies going on all around you all the time. This is the place to hear about them. So there we are. Does anybody else have a related? Pam is with the Fire Safe Council, and it is a constant thing trying to work with people to learn about fire. Josh, would you like to we have about 5 minutes left. Would you like to make any comments about the work you're doing, restoration at the Rancho Cañada?
Sure. So I'm involved with the Carmel River Free Project, as well as Rancho Cañada. Very exciting projects. I've been working here locally for about 25 years, and Carmel River Free has been in the works for about 20 of those. Rancho Cañada came up much faster. I'll give some props to regional park staff, administration. They've really done an amazing job to make that project happen so quickly. But what a transformation, right? Carmel River Free, west of Highway 1, was almost all ag 15 years ago. Artichokes on the east side as well. Odella fields, all ag. And now through a lot of really progressive thinking and hard work and grant money, Carmel River Free, which is the project that's on the east side, is about 100 acres of restoration that's going to happen. We're punching 5 holes in the levee that holds the river back, so it will flood in an average 2 to 5 year flood event. We're creating a new causeway, so a second bridge under Highway 1 for those floodwaters to go out of floodplain and enter into the restored arm of the lagoon. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but maybe 12, 13 years ago, State Parks did a restoration project where they excavated out an arm of the historic lagoon. So we're now going to connect that, and so that will have hydrologic connection and dynamically reproduce historic hydrologic scouring effects, so that steelhead habitat will be hopefully permanently created and maintained from natural processes. And then Cañada, right, is right next to that, where they moved 160,000 cubic yards of soil to bring, you were talking earlier when you get that channelized riverbank, right? And it's gone down about 15 feet. And so can you bring that riverbank back up, the bed bank up? Well, they decided to bring the floodplain back down. So they moved 160,000 cubic yards of soil. And the first of 3 phases was completed this year, and we watched the Carmel River hydrologically connect with this first phase and flood a very large section of what was a golf course. So there's a lot going on in the lower floodplain of the Carmel River, and you guys should be super proud and excited about that. Huge transformation.
I have a question. This has been, congratulations on the work you're doing. This has been an exceedingly wet year.
So far, about 150%.
So that's not typical, not in our area. We have 5-year droughts, like it was more than normal. What's going to happen after all of this work if we go back into that scenario? What will we do? How badly will that affect your property?
It won't badly affect it. It will be part of a dynamic hydrologic scenario that's actually going to support native habitats and native species. I think it was mentioned earlier, the bullfrog issue. You know, we tend to think, if you don't understand the dynamics of Mediterranean climate, that the more water you have, the better, right? Well, these systems are designed, not designed. God. The systems typically have functioned in a Mediterranean climate where there are exactly what you said, long, pronounced droughts, right? And so our flora, our fauna have adapted to those sort of conditions. And without those conditions, if you create artificially wet or conditions that create standing water that otherwise wouldn't exist, you get non-native predatory species that impact the native species. So while it's fantastic in this wet year to see the new floodplain connect, and we planted 170,000 plants, and so we want to see those plants get watered this year. I would love to see a couple more rain years, and then I'd love to see a 5-year drought, because that will promote and enable conditions that are consistent with a natural Mediterranean climate. Keep those bullfrogs out, keep those fish, keep the fish out, keep the non-native plants that aren't adapted, right, to that drought condition. So we're looking forward to that stochastic Mediterranean climate that has wet and dry.
I love that word, Josh. I need to learn that. Stochastic. Man. That's a good one. Well, our next Science Uncorked is going to be February 19th. We're covering innovations in desalination. And the reason why we're doing that is because as you know, the desalination plant is moving ahead. And yet, that desalination plant is based upon the design that was created 20 years ago when was it, Scott? Approved by the CPUC? I mean, not by the Coastal Commission, was it 15 years ago or 20 years ago? Yeah. And we're all quite worried about the pricing and what that will look like. And so I've been reaching out. I spoke with Dr. Fisk of the National Alliance for Water Innovation, and they're actually doing some really interesting projects along the Salinas area. And so what I wanted to have us look at is what kind of innovations are being done that are possible for our area that might be able to decrease some of the pricing and make it still possibilities for our area. They're doing a pilot project actually up in Fort Bragg, which is where they have a floating thing that's out in the waves. And so the energy of the waves is managing the processing of the water. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation in February about desalination. I always want to put an extra syllable there. Desalination. You're free to take home all these booklets, and there's a piece there for donations and a sign up there. Buy some wine and take it home because 30% comes back to us. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.